Hello, and welcome to our fireside chat with DiverseIQ and Ariel Investments. I'm your host, Dan Berlingeri from DiverseIQ, and I'm joined today by DiverseIQ's CEO and founder, Josh Raymer, here to discuss the state of diversity and human capital management from our extensive research and analysis of U.S. public company performance. I'm also joined today by Ariel's Chief Communications Officer, Ariel Patrick, who will discuss the results of Ariel's new Black Corporate Director study, which shines a light on the true state of corporate DEI progress from the perspective of the rank and file and leading Fortune 500 directors. Between Ariel's recent findings and DiverseIQ's own research, we will discuss the recent trends of corporate diversity and performance and DEI practices, the present-day DEI backlash facing the U.S. economy, and where we believe the future of corporate performance and shareholder engagement is heading in 2025. Welcome, Josh and Ariel. How are you doing today?
We're great. Thank you so much for having us. This study is a labor of love, and we're just excited to share more about what we found.
Yeah, great to be here and really excited to talk about what we're seeing and where we expect things to go in the future.
Fantastic. Ariel, let's start with you. Really curious, can you just tell us a little bit about why you started this Black Corporate Directors study?
Sure. Thanks again for having me. So Ariel Investments, if you don't know, we are the oldest Black-owned mutual fund company in the country and have expanded of late, in the past 10 years into a diversified asset management firm with many different strategies. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. And I think a big part of the responsibility that we see with our unique perspective as a diverse-owned company is to continue to add to the conversation and make things better. So 22 years ago, we founded the Black Corporate Directors Conference, which is a convening of Black and Latino and Latina directors of Fortune 500 companies. When we started in 2002, there were only 38 directors of color that we could locate to convene in our beautiful location in Laguna Beach, California. Today, we actually have to cut the list down because we are so over capacity. This year, we welcomed over 250 directors. So it really speaks to the benefit of convening these groups and also making sure that we're serving as a referral source pipeline to help get more directors appointed. So when I joined the firm almost 4 years ago, one of the first questions that I had was, what insights are we gleaning from this group, and why is it such an enclave? What can we share out that others can benefit from? We do believe in making sure that that conference is confidential, off the record. We do invite major CEOs to come speak and talk about where they're winning and losing on DEI. So keeping that convening and the conversations within it confidential is important. But I just felt like there was so much wisdom in the room. We had to find a way to share with others the problems that we're seeing as well as what's tracking and trending upward. So we basically just pulled together a list of questions a few years ago and now have turned it into an annual effort. And the topics that we cover are corporate governance trends, what it's like to be a director on these boards, and progress made or not made on DEI, especially as it relates to how it's being operationalized and embedded within corporate strategy, and what the role of the board is on overseeing those efforts.
Excellent. And so impressive that you were able to turn that community into a study and research that can be actioned on. That's really exciting. I'm excited for our audiences to take a deeper dive into that work.
Thank you.
Josh, over to you. Since DiverseIQ was founded in early 2021, what are some of the major trends or big changes that you've been seeing in the market since our inception? Oh, you're on mute.
The biggest change we've seen, and this started almost right away when we were founded. So we were founded in January 2021. It's just a lot more transparency and disclosure of characteristics about board members. And so, it used to be in the proxy statement where a lot of this, where a lot of companies talk about their board and their strategy for recruiting new members. their governance guidelines would talk about the experience and skills and qualities that they looked for in board members, and they might mention gender and race and ethnicity and other things, but it was kind of an afterthought. Whereas kind of in 2021, we started to see a lot of companies make specific commitments to increase the diversity of their board, women and people of color, through either pledges like the board challenge, where they said, I pledge to, or I commit to hire a Black board member within the next 12 months. But more often, a commitment to a diverse slate for recruitment, something along the lines of a Rooney Rule, which now 57% of the S&P 500 have that explicit policy where they say we're going to actively go out and recruit women and people of color for our board. So in 2018, which is the benchmark that Ariel was using, the S&P 500 had 24.5% women. Now it's up to 34.6. So over 10% jump, and people of color we've seen went from 17.2% to 25.8. A lot of those gains were made between 2020 and 2022. We've seen a little bit of stagnation, but still an impressive jump. And so a lot of it was the companies really changing their policies and explicitly saying we want to get more diverse, and starting to work with organizations like the Latino Corporate Directors Association and others, where they were actively partnering and saying, help us find a pipeline of board ready candidates. But also talking about disclosures. So when we started looking at this, so 2020, companies in aggregate, 46% of the S&P 500 reported the aggregate race and ethnicity of their board, and now it's up to 98%. So nearly every board is now reporting the aggregate racial and ethnic makeup of their board. And individuals identifying the race and ethnicity of each individual director went from 7% to 53%. So now more than half are actually disclosing race and ethnicity of each individual director. And we've seen that across the board with gender and race and kind of intersectionality. And LGBTQ plus went from basically 2% to almost 30% of companies disclosing the aggregate makeup. A lot of that was kind of legislation and mandates. So California passed a law where public companies based in California had to kind of comply or explain why they didn't hit a certain mandate or level. And NASDAQ passed a similar bill where they had to, NASDAQ listed companies had to disclose the makeup of their board, hit a certain mandate, and if not, explain why they didn't. Those things have been challenged in court, but what we've seen is once that bill passes, or once there's something in place, even when it's challenged or even when it's struck down, the ball's rolling downhill, and companies continue to double down on those commitments and also just say this is still important to us and we still need to make more progress. So a lot more language about it in their proxies and in other places, and also just a lot more transparency about the makeup of their board and how it's changed. A lot of it has been, we've heard companies say, and we've heard the LCDA say this, oh, we didn't even know that we had 2 board members that identified as Latino or Hispanic. And so a lot of it was just bringing a lot of this information, bringing it to light, making it public, and giving people the opportunity to self-identify. So those are the biggest changes have been a huge amount of more transparency, disclosure, and then a lot of progress towards more diversity.
Excellent. Ariel, just curious, what were you finding from the results of your study, and do you feel like they supported or contradicted some of the DEI backlash that we've been experiencing? Notably, events like the SCOTUS ruling, anti-DEI and ESG campaigns, lawsuits, attacks from conservative activists in the space. What have you noticed from that study?
So we are here to say that despite a lot of the media kerfuffle, our directors are saying, 98% of our directors are saying that DEI remains a primary agenda item for them, for their boards. I say that with emphasis because there is a broad spectrum of topics that are incredibly important to directors, among them risk, audit, cyber, the list goes on and on. So to say that something is primary is truly, truly significant. And I don't want to underestimate that. I think also what's interesting to me is that the majority of that group is saying that DEI was added as a primary agenda item several years ago, and a smaller percentage are saying that it was added recently, which is even better news because we did take this survey after the SCOTUS decision was disclosed. But then where we're seeing the pain point is if you're going to say that something is a primary agenda item and that it is a business imperative for your institution, how are you supporting progress in that area? And I think a bit more infrastructure is required to make sure that DEI is not solely, for example, on a one single chief diversity officer, and is really taken on by a full governing body as well as the entire management team to make sure that it touches, the human capital piece, the supply chain piece, the philanthropy and public affairs piece, as well as the product piece, to ensure, of course, that institutions are prepared and nailing how to reach their core customer. So I guess what I'm trying to say is DEI is one of the few topics where if a CEO gets on a quarterly call with investors and says, we're working on it, we're trying to make progress, that's okay. But if he or she were to say that about financial goals or missing earnings guidance, they'd be fired. You need more heft behind those kinds of statements. And I think more measurable, trackable, reportable, and rigorous data being shared out, not only in an annual ESG report, but on a regular basis with constituents can go a long way in the way that you would on a quarterly basis about financials. So I say we have great news, but my caveat is some of the observations we made are that there is more room for discipline in those areas.
Excellent. Excellent. It's actually reassuring to hear the corroboration of the trends between you two from different perspectives. That's really exciting to hear. Josh, what have you noticed from your perspective on the recent trends around DEI backlash?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we talk about this is it's a lot of noise, but under the hood, not much is changing. So companies are changing how they communicate this. They're being more careful about their language, both from a PR perspective, not wanting to become the next Bud Light or kind of be in the spotlight for things. And even the companies that have been attacked specifically, have been specifically targeted, they're making some service level changes, but we don't foresee much changing under the hood. Also, what we saw in 2021, a lot of companies were being reactionary. A lot of companies had never done an internal survey asking their own employees what was important to them, how they felt, why they worked there, why they left. And so, it was a lot of kind of, let's just do something and generically, let's just build something, and everyone was building the same thing. And it's now companies are kind of, it's like anything else. You have to try and get better and figure out what works for your company. And so, a lot of companies hired a chief diversity officer or built a separate diversity department. And now a lot of them are realizing it doesn't make sense and it's not effective. And it's actually just part of HR or people management. And it needs to be ingrained in the company's culture and how they do everything. And so, the headline is that, oh, the chief diversity officer is not, those jobs aren't as prevalent and they're being laid off, but it's really just companies rethinking how to do well here. And a lot of companies continue to talk about it in their proxy or in their ESG DEI reporting. They're just not promoting it as much. And also they have to be a lot more careful legally because they're being targeted for, so companies have been setting goals around hitting specific targets for women and people of color overall or in leadership, or, we want to have this percentage of hires be these groups. And so they have to be a lot more careful. So most of the companies we're talking to, most of the corporates are doing a legal audit and being really careful about, we want to make progress. We want to set goals, but we don't want to be targeted and we don't want to be, in violation of these laws. So they're being more careful. But again, when we're talking about workforce diversity, human capital, we've seen an explosion in the amount of disclosure, the granularity in disclosure. It started with just workforce representation, which is interesting and useful, but it's just a look at a point in time, and you don't know why things are changing or how, or the levers that companies can pull. Now, a lot more large companies have committed to disclosing hiring, promotion, turnover rates overall, and by those same groups, so you can really see, where are the challenges and where are the opportunities. Is it that they're not attracting the right people, they're not retaining them, or they're not able to promote them through the ranks? And so Google or Alphabet's been disclosing a lot of this data for over 10 years now, and they're still struggling to make progress. And you can kind of see that it's really about promotion and like retaining and promoting diverse talent, especially at the leadership levels. And so now you can start to engage them and talk to them about, what are the challenges and why are people not leaving. The same thing with pay gaps or pay equity. A lot more companies are starting to disclose those pay gaps for women and people of color. And so, more data is a great starting point. And then, you're able to kind of see benchmarks and who's doing well and what's working. The big challenge with all of this is it's all voluntary in the US. It's almost all voluntary in the US. So companies can decide what to disclose, how to disclose it, where to disclose it. They can change year to year the way they classify things. So it's still a big challenge, but we've seen a lot of progress with just companies realizing that transparency is really important for not just investors and stakeholders, but for employees, especially the younger generation. Just Capital does a survey every year of several 100,000 Americans about what's important to them for a company and what the company focuses on. And worker issues are always the biggest thing that people care about. And wage fairness is the biggest thing that always comes up. And so, it's, we continue to see this trend of companies realizing this is really important to attract and retain a great workforce and be able to compete with their peers. And we're not seeing that changing. It's really just changing the language they're using and how they're communicating all of this, both to their, to the public, but also to their employees and their other stakeholders.
I
It
love.
sounds like,
Oh, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, I love the comment about the chief diversity officer role. I do believe that needs a rethink and an upgrade, because in order for there to be credible and effective execution of this myriad of corporate initiatives, that person needs to have not only the skills and expertise, but also the permission and the support to partner across all facets of an organization instead of being in a silo. Often you're seeing chief diversity officers coming out of the HR function, which is great. However, it may communicate, if not done well, that the only lever that the institution is looking at is human capital, when that person needs also the ability to work with the finance team and with the chief procurement officer to make sure that they're looking at vendor mix. That person needs to be able to work with corporate affairs and communications to make sure that the messaging is cascading, and also that public-private partnerships and philanthropic partnerships align with values. And then they also need to have a close connection to the research and development and marketing teams on who's at the table and how they're looking at developing product or whatever their services to better serve their community. So I just say that to say it's almost as if someone were to say that financial goals are solely on the CFO alone. That wouldn't make sense. And so it's a collective effort that everyone with P&L responsibilities needs to rally around. And so the CDO needs to be empowered to galvanize that group and also have the expertise to do that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you keep mentioning like investors are happy to use all of this other financial data and use it quarterly. And companies themselves didn't really have the ability to do that with this type of data. They all talk about how some version of people are our most important asset, and usually it's also the most expensive asset to attract and retain and train all those people. So understanding, how much does it cost to hire somebody and train them and develop them versus companies that maybe turn people over more, and being able to evaluate the differences and like what is effective from a cost and like ROI perspective. but also the different things that, why do people work there, and why do they leave, and what different levers can we pull? And yeah, it's, just like all of this reporting is a cross-functional um, role where all these companies, all these people get together to tell the story about why this is all important and how they're doing. It's the same thing with culture and people in DEI. It just needs to be a part of everything companies do, because especially as our economy becomes more and more of a service economy, people become a more important part of all of this.
Right, right. I want to keep on this thread, actually, this thread of operationalizing DEI. Ariel, what kind of actionable lessons do you feel like your directors and corporate leaders should be taking away from your study? And do you think that they should be doing anything differently with just communicating business objectives, both to those employees and to their shareholders as well?
Sure. I think, like any primary agenda item, as our directors are calling it, the board, in partnership with management, needs to look at the following: measurement, so key dates, deadlines, accountability, so making sure that leadership comp actually reflects the goals, capital committed, making sure it's sufficient with also deadlines and is assessed annually, transparency, so regular updates, reporting, not only outside, but taking actually special care to communicate internally first. And we'll talk about later on why I think that's important, because we did learn a lot from our general population average worker data on where there's a disconnect and what leadership believes is impactful and what they maybe don't buy. To that same thread, education from the rank and file to the C-suite on why that's important, but also with evidence on why it is a business imperative and what everyone stands to gain as a business by prioritizing this. A couple other ideas include making sure that if you are going to recruit diverse directors or people with DEI expertise, that they have correct oversight of this topic on relevant committees. So we're talking on the board level. So nominating and governance, risk, those are forums where this topic come up, and you need the right people around the table to make sure that it's looked at on a regular basis. And then just lastly, if it really truly is a primary agenda item, make sure it's always on the agenda indefinitely in meetings and not glazed over. So essentially the same way you would comprise a recipe for success for any business goal.
Excellent, excellent. It sounds as well that, both of your responses to the backlash is that overall corporate response is somewhat cosmetic. It's somewhat surface level, where we might be seeing trends over these last couple of years that companies are starting to consolidate practices and figure out how best to operationalize DEI, right? I think we're learning that over these last couple of years. And I'm sure the results of your study, Ariel, are helping that move forward, helping that needle move forward.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Yeah. Josh, based on what you're hearing from corporates and investors, what do you expect will be different heading into this next year of shareholder and proxy season compared to last year?
Yeah, I mentioned legislation and mandates, and that was part of it. But more than that, it was major stakeholders that really made a big impact. So I'm talking about the largest asset managers in the world, BlackRock and State Street, started to include in their proxy voting guidelines specific thresholds for you need to disclose all this information, but we expect you to have at least 30% women and 2 people of color on your board by this date, or some level like that. And if you don't, we're going to vote out your committee chairs. The proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis, included similar similar wording in their guidelines, and other major investors. So a lot of it was through direct engagement, a lot of it was through shareholder proposals for this sort of thing, and then a lot of it was through these sort of guidelines. And it was really those big investors were getting behind a lot of this, where in the past it might have been considered fringe. And so I think that's kind of what pushed it over the edge, at least initially. And I don't expect that to change. What we're hearing is that, again, they're just being more careful about how they word it, how they talk about it. there is a little bit of this worry where it's now going back to, well, we're talking more about experience of, like skills and experience, the diversity of skills and diversity of thought. And what I've heard from several people is, listen, the problem with that is first of all, it becomes this box checking exercise like it was in the past. And also the problem is it's also the chicken or the egg. The reason there weren't Black and Hispanic board directors is because it was always, well, we need people that were in the C-suite or we're on a board to get on a board. And it's like, well, first of all, you can't, like, those people weren't getting the opportunities to be in the C-suite first. So you can't say, well, they have to have that first. And it just became this thing where, oh, we have this matrix and it's showing these skills. And look, we have a lot of diversity. We have people from different industries and different jobs. And so, what we're hearing from a lot of investors and activists and, people that really care about this is we're going to keep pushing. We're going to engage with these companies to make sure they don't backslide. I don't see much changing. I think, again, we'll see a little bit less on the shareholder proposal side, mostly just because there's been a lot of progress made and like they don't need to push as many companies. But also, I think most companies are already, have a lot of these policies, programs in place. There's been a lot of progress made. In the S&P 500, there's now 84% of the companies have at least one Black director. That's up from 70%. 37% have at least two Black directors. That's up from 26%. So again, it's, we've seen a lot of progress, and that's why I think there's this stagnation. It's not like they're not, it's not as important. I think a lot of this is political theater. So I'm guessing that after the election, it's not going to be the most important thing on a lot of these politicians' minds, holding hearings and, talking about this. I do think the conservative legal organizations are going to continue to pursue this because they have a lot of funding and it seems to be a big focus area. But, again, I don't foresee a lot of these lawsuits being effective. I think if a company says, they're going to be a little bit more vague with their language. They're going to say, we want to get more diverse because we want to match the population, or, there's ways that they can say it. And I think there is that huge gap between, if you look at, especially at leadership levels, people of color and the overall population, and women and the overall population, or even the available population of people who have those skills and experiences. So I don't see that much changing, other than, again, just the, communicating this and like publicly speaking about it. But from what we hear, all the big stakeholders, when they talk to companies, they're continuing to push on this. They're not going to change that. They're not going to fall back. And again, there's a handful of companies that are going to have to make that choice and balance their, some stakeholders versus their customers. And it's a big risk for Molson Coors, for instance. They have to kind of change their PR strategy. And there's some companies that were doing this box checking or doing something because they were getting a lot of pressure and they're stepping back. But I don't see this changing. I do think in the future we will see more kind of mandated, compulsory reporting of a lot of this human capital and diversity data, which will just help kind of, institutionalize it, make it more apples to apples comparisons, and really just have better data to make decisions. But I think the ball is rolling downhill. I think companies are doing it because it's so important to most of their stakeholders, and that's just going to become more prevalent. I'm actually really shocked by, the companies that are backsliding on some of the things. The companies that have been pressured where they're not going to work with the Human Rights Campaign on their corporate equality index, or they're saying they're going to, roll back setting goals for diverse supplier spending. Because I think they are at risk, especially with their employees, of being able to attract and retain the right people. And if Ford is going to do that, it's going to be hard for them to compete with GM. And if Lowe's is going to do that, it's going to be hard for them to compete with Home Depot. So I think it's a little bit reactionary, and they're just doing something now, but they're really going to have to think about long term. How does that look to their employees and their vendors and other stakeholders? And we're seeing a little bit of that backlash now for some of these companies that are making those decisions. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I think I loved your comment about what I would call the excuse that has been used for diverse recruiting, especially at the board level, on qualification. So is this person, an experienced CEO, do they have P&L responsibilities or the requisite expertise? my favorite part of our study, it's at the very end, is we gather fun facts about these, Black and Latino directors.
Mm.
And I think there's two data points that I think should hopefully dispel any notion that diverse directors, if you look in the right places and have the right network, are less qualified. So the first is over half, so 52% of our attendees of our conference, which is the majority of the Fortune 500 diverse directors, accepted their first public company board seat before the age of 50. And the average age of an S&P 500 independent board director is 63. So this is a group that 13 years ahead of the average board director had the skills required to sit on a public board. So I think there is this exceptionalism almost that's demanded of diverse directors in order for them to even get to that place. That's just my thought. The second is 68%, almost 70% of this group have a postgraduate degree, so master's, PhD, et cetera, compared to 14% of the general population. We didn't compare that to, sort of white male directors, but that might be something to look at. I just think that's fascinating. What's sad, though, is only 24% of this group is serving in a board chair role, and only half are currently serving in a committee chair role. So those numbers aren't matching up, just saying.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. One of our, so we track board leadership, and it's definitely, there's a huge gap between even the levels on the overall board and the leadership levels. And one of our clients just asked, in these policies or in any language, do they talk about prioritizing, elevating diverse board members to leadership? And like, do they have a program or a plan? Are they setting goals? And we've heard companies boast of having diverse board leadership, but we've never heard a company say we're prioritizing elevating, or even talk about the process for how somebody becomes the chair of a committee or the board chair. And so that's really interesting. Yeah, and the age thing is interesting. So the average age of S&P 500 has been relatively steady at 63 to 64 for the last 10 years. And like, it seems like most companies require that like you have all of this experience just meaning years of working, in these different roles. The other big challenge is that the average tenure is between 8 and 9 years, and that hasn't changed much. And so there's just not that much turnover. Some of the things that companies do, or the levers they can pull, is mandatory retirement age. So 61% of the S&P 500 has a mandatory retirement age. The problem, what we've heard from some stakeholders, is that one, and term limits not as much, only 8.6%, but one is that they use that to push out board members when they hit a certain term, that they don't, it's like an easy way to say like, oh, well, let's push this person out that we don't think is right anymore. But also we see a lot of exemptions where companies will say, well, this person's skills are just so important. So they just keep, every year they keep saying, well, they hit 75, but we're just going to keep extending them, and that'll keep happening. So it's a policy, but it's kind of not, it's not, it's not that effective, and we've seen good arguments why those things aren't a great way to do it. But anyway, there's just not that much turnover, and board seats don't come up that much, and so that's been one of the other reasons why we've seen stagnation. But yeah, the leadership it's really interesting, and the chairs of these committees have a lot of power, and we've seen a lot more splitting of the board chair, or where there's the CEO is also the chair, but they have a lead independent director, and the diversity there is just not trended up like the overall diversity has. And it doesn't seem like companies are thinking about that. It doesn't seem like stakeholders are really pushing companies to think about that or come up with plans. And so when you talk about like institutionalizing DEI and figuring out, like, setting goals and actually figuring out how you're going to get there, maybe that's an area where we'll see companies start talking about it, or stakeholders starting to say, hey, we're not seeing a lot of diversity there. What are you doing about it? We do see, a lot of our clients care about it. They track it. And actually what we've heard is that, and that's the other thing that I just want to mention, is that, a lot of people we hear are like, well, we're still waiting for proof that this matters and that there's a tie between this stuff and performance. And like, you're going to be waiting forever, right? Because like a lot of this is just, it's almost impossible to isolate an individual board member and their effect on financial performance, and try to say that this is financially material using all of this data. And in general, I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of this leads to kind of second order metrics. So like, it's people have great cultures, great DEI, have lower turnover, and therefore like a lower cost of attracting and retaining a great workforce. Or companies that have great cultures measured by being on the best companies to work for. There's a lot of evidence that those companies outperform. So you're not going to see that direct evidence. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people still say, well, you haven't made the case that this really matters and that we should invest in this.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's really interesting what you mentioned about the board leadership.
Ariel, do you have any, since your last study, just kind of looking at it in a wider view, since your last study, have any concerns for you emerged since the previous study? And then what are your hopes moving forward for this next year?
This is actually related to what Josh was just talking about, is people needing proof. What troubled me the most is that there's a vast misalignment between leaders at the top, so the directors that we are surveying, as well as the average worker that we've surveyed, on whether DEI is important, particularly race on the broad spectrum of DEI, and then also why companies are prioritizing it. There's confusion. It's not the same. So if you were to ask our group of directors, majority said that race receives too little attention in the boardroom and needs to continue to be more of a focus in the future on the broad spectrum of DEI topics. If you ask the average employee, a significant number felt that race receives too much attention in the conversation on DEI. And maybe it's not surprising, maybe it is, white male workers were over half of white male workers felt that race received too much attention, but not too far behind were, white women, Hispanic men, the list goes on and on. So the question is, if you think that something is being overblown, do you understand why it's being focused on in the first place? And so then we asked, well, what are the reasons why DEI is on your corporate agenda? We asked the directors that. And the majority of them said a genuine interest in the experience of diverse employees, stakeholders, and other constituents. If you ask workers, no matter what race, popular responses included public relations and political concerns. That's why they think their management is focused on this. So there's skepticism. They believe it's an outward effort. They believe it's a branding effort. And perhaps don't understand the altruism behind it from their leadership team. But to me, that means they don't have the data to actually say this is good for business, that when you diversify your supply chain, you mitigate risk and create opportunities for underserved communities. When you have the right team around the table that's diverse on research and development and marketing, you mitigate risk because your product actually resonates with the people you're trying to reach. The list goes on and on. But I don't think enough communications focus has been placed on what I would call an inside-out approach to communications, where you're prioritizing your employee base first before going out and putting out pretty press releases and statements. And that's something that I coach my team on, and how we communicate even at Ariel. Before we put something out, have we spoken to employees about this first and explained the why? Have we gone to key clients who we know, if they saw something in the public forum, would want to have been spoken to first? So it comes back to, good communications.
Yeah, and I think the right is winning here, right? Because companies feel like there's not a lot of benefit to speak publicly about this and why it's so important. There's a handful of leaders, Jamie Dimon, again, keeps reinforcing why it's important to JP Morgan and that it still is that important and that we can't back off. But he has that currency in the market to be able to do that. There's not many leaders that can do that. And if they do, there's a risk. And I'm guessing the board and the chief legal officer is saying, it's okay to communicate internally, but even there, be careful, because half the time it leaks out and it becomes political. I mean, just look what happened to Disney. Disney cares very much, not only about their employees, but about their creators. They have a whole group internally focused on diversity for creators, but taking a stand is not always beneficial to the company, and so it's. But I agree, like clear communication, and there needs to be more leaders standing up and saying why this is important publicly, and not just when they're in these face-to-face meetings, and not just in these financial documents, which most people aren't going to look at, or else it's going to be a one-sided conversation, and it's going to become this, these companies having to react and say one thing publicly and then figure out how to tell their employees, why they had to make that decision. So I agree. If you start with your employees and then you work your way out, and you're really clear on communicating that, and I think some of these people, it's not a conversation. They're not looking to actually have a conversation and talk about why it's important. So it's also kind of, again, a lot of this is going to be noise, but being clear with your key stakeholders why it's important and why you're making this investment. And again, we see that under the hood. We see that continuing to happen, but it's not resonating. And it's even with employees, there seems to be this disconnect. I think it's not very different, but we're seeing the same thing with like work from home, where companies are like not listening to their employees and what matters to them, and kind of trying to see how it can benefit a company to be much more flexible with hybrid work. And again, I think it's going to hurt cultures, and it's a lot of these companies which have been known for great cultures are kind of instilling this mandate of you have to work this way or else you shouldn't work here. And I think that's an opportunity too. I think all this is an opportunity for companies to lead in this space and really talk about why it's important, and then they're gonna be able to stand out and attract and retain a great workforce and really outperform their peers.
Excellent. Thank you both for your time today. This brings us to the close of our time. Just want to say a big thank you to you both for taking the time. And for our listeners, if you like this content, there's plenty more to check out on diversiiq.com. We have blogs, articles, papers, webinars, and topics like this. And you can join our newsletter by signing up at diversiiq.com/newsletter. If you want to access Ariel's Black Corporate Director Study, make sure to make your way to rielinvestments.com, where you can access those results as well as featured news and insights. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.